We covered this case when there's multiple sprites in one texture. How would you work with SDF in this scenario? If we look at SDF importer, we can see that this texture does not have border offset. We can add it and it will be viable. However, it will only be added to the edges and not between the sprites itself. So the SDF pixels is still gonna be cut off because it will collide with other sprites. So the only way right now is to manually increase the canvas size and to add to original textures all the offsets between sprites that you need. I'll select another sprite and put it into the scene. It don't need to have any mesh scale, but we still can see that the SDF is being cut off. Why is that? It happens because bounding box of the sprite in import settings is configured to be tightly packed, meaning there is no offset to the edges. Let's try to make this bounding box bigger. Also, for this to work, we need to set a mesh type to full rect. Here we can see that it became better. There is not so much SDF being cut off. There is still issues with that. In samples, there is already configured multiple sprites texture in order to work somehow correctly. It has full rect. Its sprites has a big bounding box with offsets to the edges. I'm gonna put it into the scene, and as we can see, SDF still being cut off. It's kind of fine, and the only thing we can do quickly is to decrease the SDF multiplier. Changing the mesh scale doesn't really do any good. It's particularly weird for multiple sprites texture. So if we want to increase SDF effect even more, what could we do? We need to increase the canvas size and manually drag all the sprites to make bigger offsets between them. I'm just gonna quickly do this in Photoshop. All of them is not correctly centered. They have some offsets for each of it, but we can see the situation is better. Such a big SDF effect not being cut off at the left, right, and bottom, and because of the offset, the top is slightly cutted. Also, let's try to completely remove the outer edge offsets on all sides. And I'm still gonna drag the sprites apart to make a bigger offsets between them. Let's slice the sprites again. They're sliced kind of weirdly, off-centered. And since we don't have any edges offset on the original image, it's logical to add a border offset, right? If we pump the mesh scale, it will be valid. However, there is this weird artifacts. First off is sprite not being centered. This is the actual edges of the image, and the top and right side has just an empty space if we disable the SDF. The second is that a parts of another sprites and the same textures are leaking to this image. Let's try something else. Decrease the size of the bounding box of the sprite, make it tightly packed. And this fixes the problems with sprite not being centered. It's centered right now. And even with such big mesh scale, there is almost no leaks. However, this is not okay. So we need to decrease the border offset a little and correspondingly change the mesh scale. And this is pretty good. However, there is still an underlay artifact. We can see underlay from top sprite. And if we change the offsets, the underlays from other sprites will still leak into this image. So, which is the best workflow for multiple sprites on the one texture? First, you can manually add all of the offsets between sprites, and also offsets to the edges of the texture. You need to make them pretty big. Second approach is to make offsets between sprites manually in Photoshop, but don't add any offsets to the texture edges, and use the mesh scale and border offset to compensate for them. However, the best approach is to just use singular textures. One texture, one sprite. Generated with border offset or not, it still would be the safest and easiest and comfortable approach. I'm gonna be working on improving the multiple sprites workflow. I have an ideas, and this is something that will be delivered in next updates. That's it. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.